For Beatrice, books were a solitary escape from a cruel life. She never imagined her brilliant mind would capture the guarded heart of the Duke of Rochester. In the quiet of his legendary library, two lonely souls discover a love that defies all of society. Together, they will prove that the greatest romances are written not in grand ballrooms, but in the margins of a page. Let us turn the page and see where it all begins. The silence in the narrow room beneath the roof of Hastings' house was Beatrice's sole fortune. Sitting on the uneven floorboards, her back to the door, she took advantage of the sliver of pale afternoon light to read. Resting on her lap was an out-of-print copy of Natural Philosophy, bought for a few pennies from a traveling tutor. That slender volume was her passage out of her family's mediocrity. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs. Beatrice stiffened. She snapped the book shut and tried to hide it beneath the worn skirt of her dark dress, but the door was pushed open before she could rise. Clara and Eleanor entered. The brilliant silks of her elder sisters seemed to suck the air from the modest room. Their faces, painted to impress guests who rarely paid them any mind, bore the dangerous boredom of those who needed someone to blame for their own frustrations. Father is trying to convince the Duke of Rochester to invest in the northern mines, and you are up here, hiding like an insect, Clara said, crossing her arms, her narrowed eyes sweeping the room. She would only embarrass us if she came down, Clara, Eleanor retorted, with a disdainful smile. But what is she hiding there? Before Beatrice could retreat against the wall, Clara lunged forward with cruel agility and grabbed her sister's arm. The book slipped from the skirt and fell to the floor with a dull thud. Ah, of course. Always a book. Clara picked up the volume, inspecting the worn cover with revulsion. You truly think yourself superior to us because you bury your nose in this dead dust, don't you? Please, give it back, Beatrice pleaded, her voice low, fighting to maintain her neutrality. To show emotion was to sign her own death warrant. Give it back? Eleanor laughed and kicked the trunks beneath the bed until she heard the sound of wood. She dragged out the rustic box Beatrice used to store her small collection of 12 books. Panic finally broke the younger sister's mask of indifference. No, please, leave the box. Beatrice tried to throw herself forward, but Clara pushed her by the shoulders, forcing her to fall back. Do you think you will find a husband reading about rocks and stars? No one wants a woman with ink-stained hands and a head full of useless ideas, Clara hissed. With a violent tug, Clara tore the cover off the philosophy book. The sound of fabric and paper ripping echoed like a dry crack. Beatrice let out a stifled whimper, her eyes wide. In seconds, the two sisters turned their boredom into a destructive fury. They pulled the volumes from the box, tearing handfuls of pages, breaking dry spines, trampling on the leaves that fell to the floor. They destroyed the intellectual voices that kept her sane. When nothing remained but a scattered pile of rubbish, Clara took a deep breath, satisfied, her face flushed from the effort. Learn your place. Clear up this mess before dinner. They left. Their laughter resumed in the corridor, entirely free of guilt. In the bedroom, Beatrice remained, trembling, surrounded by the corpse of her inner world. She did not scream. Her entire body shook in silent spasms. Dragging herself across the floor, her cold fingers touched the remains of her precious books. The stories were mutilated, the spines destroyed. Amidst the chaos, her eyes caught a fragment. It was a single, loose page, with only one of the edges torn on a diagonal, but the text was still there. She picked it up, clutching it to her chest, so tightly her knuckles turned white. Suffocated by the walls that now seemed to crush her, Beatrice needed air. She ran. She descended the narrow servants' staircase at the back, passed unseen through the service corridor, and pushed open the heavy side door. The cold autumn wind cut across her face. Guided by pure survival instinct, She dashed across the rear lawn until she threw herself behind the dense, untrimmed hedge of white roses. Hidden from the view of the windows, she fell to her knees in the damp earth. There, clutching the sheet of paper, the dam of her resistance finally broke, and she wept. A mute, agonizing cry of someone who had nothing left to lose. 30 paces away, the heavy glass doors of the ground-floor study opened. Arthur Pendelton, the Duke of Rochester, stepped out onto the stone terrace. His posture was rigid, his shoulders perfectly aligned in his impeccable dark coat. The meeting with the Hastings patriarch had been an ordeal of mediocrity and greed that bordered on insult. He breathed in the cold air, seeking to clear his mind of the pathetic proposals he had just refused. Mr. Hastings was right behind him, wringing his hands nervously. "Your Grace, if you would permit me just one more observation regarding the Valley lands." The man tried, in vain, to prolong the aristocrat's attention. Arthur did not answer. He stopped abruptly on the terrace step, his head tilted to the right. Above them, from the open windows of the first floor, the sound of 2 female voices laughing shrilly pierced the afternoon. The laughter carried a petty triumph that made the Duke furrow his brows in disgust. It was an empty, futile sound. But what truly caught his attention did not come from above, but from below, from a hidden corner near the white roses. Arthur possessed a singular ability to ignore the noise and focus on the discreet. He noticed the slight rustling of the leaves and, through the branches, the dark gray fabric of a dress. And then he noticed the movement, the continuous, rhythmic trembling of shoulders, shaken by weeping. He looked from the window down to the shrub, processing the scene, the victorious malice above, the hidden desolation below. A cutting coldness replaced the simple irritation in his chest. Arthur despised frivolity, but he harbored an absolute, silent hatred for the cowardice that fed on the defenseless. Without a flicker of emotion on his face, he turned his body and, instead of walking to his carriage waiting at the front of the house, descended the stone steps of the terrace towards the side garden. His boots sank silently into the gravel. The sudden sound of heavy footsteps approaching made Beatrice hold her breath. Terror seized her. She jerked her head up, her face stained with tears, and her eyes wide, expecting to find her father's wrathful face. Instead, she found herself facing the Duke of Rochester. The formidable figure of the man blocked the pale afternoon sun. His features were sharp, as if carved from hard granite, and his dark eyes swept over her prostrate figure on the ground. Beatrice felt the weight of shame. To be caught in her most pathetic moment, kneeling in the dirt, by one of the most influential and feared noblemen in England, was the final blow. Instinctively, she tried to rise, moving her trembling hands behind her back to hide the torn page, and began to smooth her soiled skirt. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon. I did not know you were—" Her voice broke in a repressed sob. Mr. Hastings, who had followed him in a fluster, arrived panting, his face red with embarrassment. "Beatrice, what is the meaning of this? Kneeling in the garden like a common servant?" "1,000 pardons, Your Grace. My middle daughter has always been undisciplined and has exotic propensities that prevent her from—" Arthur raised his gloved hand. The gesture, though slow, carried the authority of someone who never needed to shout to be obeyed. Beatrice's father stopped speaking that very second, his eyes bulging. A dense, electric silence fell over the garden. Without so much as blinking in Hastings' direction, the Duke continued to stare at Beatrice. He removed the black leather glove from his right hand, movement by movement. "What are you hiding behind your back, miss?" Arthur's voice was deep, resonant, completely devoid of mockery. It was a calm demand for the truth. Beatrice swallowed hard. The lie died in her throat, in the face of the intensity of that gaze. Slowly, she brought her closed hand forward, revealing the loose sheet of paper, its shredded edges marked by dust and tears. Arthur fixed his eyes on the page, and his jaw hardened for a fraction of a second. He understood. This was not crying over torn dresses or a broken betrothal. It was the pain of a mind that had had its sanctuary violated. The intelligence and silent desolation of that woman struck him harder than any impassioned speech ever could. The Duke finally turned his face towards the patriarch. Hastings took a step back, instinctively fearing the absolute ice in the aristocrat's demeanour. "Hastings," the Duke's voice was like the crack of an invisible whip. "I possess in Rochester one of the largest and most restricted libraries in England. I have just learned that it requires readers of its caliber." He turned his attention back to Beatrice, ignoring her father's stupid confusion. "From this day forth, Miss Beatrice has formal and exclusive permission to attend my library. Access shall be daily, for as long as she deems convenient." Mr. Hastings stammered, stunned. "Your Grace, this is unthinkable. Your doors have never opened to anyone, and she is merely—" "Let me make myself perfectly clear," the Duke cut in, taking a step closer to the man, his voice dropping to a dangerous timbre. "If Miss Beatrice is prevented from leaving this house, if she is distressed, or if a single hair on her head or a leaf of her paper is touched by any member of this family with disdain, I will make it my business to destroy every last one of your meager enterprises until you have not a single penny left. Are we understood?" The patriarch turned pale, nodding frantically, struck dumb. Arthur looked at Beatrice one last time. The hardness gave way to a minimal, almost imperceptible nod of respect. "I await your visit, Miss Beatrice. Good minds must be preserved from barbarism." He turned his back and walked with long strides towards his carriage, leaving behind a terrified man and a woman kneeling in the dirt, who held the torn page to her chest like the key to her own salvation. Beatrice's routine at the grandiose Rochester estate quickly established itself as the sole genuine devotion of her life. The morning journey she took to the colossal wrought-iron gates became the dividing line between the purgatory of her own home and the redemption of an untouchable paradise. The Duke's library was not merely a room, it was a cathedral of thought, a sanctuary with dizzyingly high ceilings, where the thick scent of beeswax, aged leather, and sun-warmed stained glass formed the perfect atmosphere for isolation. Silence reigned absolute, broken only by the soft scrape of the heavy oak doors each morning. As soon as she found herself free to explore, Beatrice claimed the east window niche, a soft velvet seat embedded in the thick masonry, invisible to anyone entering through the main doors. It was the ideal, protected spot for someone who had spent her entire life desperately trying not to take up space. On the other side of the immense hall, seated at the head of a sturdy mahogany table covered in maps and accounting documents, the Duke of Rochester worked tirelessly. Arthur Pendelton was, from a distance, a magnetic and intimidating presence, radiating the tacit authority of a man who controlled endless lands. Yet surprisingly, his presence there was not intrusive. In the early days, they shared the air of the chamber without exchanging a single syllable. Beatrice arrived like a shadow, revered the laden shelves, chose a precious volume, and disappeared into her sunlit niche. The Duke merely lifted his somber eyes from his documents for a fraction of a second, acknowledging his guest's presence with a slight nod. That unspoken agreement of peaceful coexistence was the most valuable gift a man had ever granted her. In that inviolable refuge, she did not need to perform. She did not need to smile, a rehearsed smile, and, above all, she did not need to shrink away. Under the morning light that bathed her corner, her brilliant mind was free to absorb distant worlds without the terror of being suddenly attacked. It was at the dawn of the second week that this strict silence gained an unusual, clandestine voice. Beatrice had chosen a stout treatise on political philosophy that dealt with the minutiae and corruption of monarchical power. Upon opening the book to its central pages, she noticed that the wide, yellowed margins harbored notes written in a brisk, slanted script traced in thick black ink. The comments inserted in the margins were acidic, surgical, and overflowed with a dark cynicism regarding the high aristocracy. It was unquestionable that sharp handwriting belonged to Arthur. Power does not alter a man's soul. It merely removes the fear of consequences and reveals the baseness that the lack of power had concealed. Read one of the firm notes beside a long paragraph on the nobility and the duties of the crown. Beatrice held her breath and read the sentence 3 times. A rebellious, untamable urge, dormant since the brutal destruction of her own books, tingled in her fingertips. She drew a tiny graphite pencil from a hidden pocket in her skirt, one she had brought only to sketch stray thoughts. Moved by an inexplicable audacity, and taking the utmost care not to crease the centuries-old paper, she wrote just below the Duke's heavy ink. Or perhaps an excess of power creates a suffocating vacuum around a man, where empathy rots simply from a lack of use. She closed the volume and returned it to the shelf, late in the afternoon, her heart beating frantically in her chest at the boundless audacity she had committed. The following morning, consumed by an uncontrollable curiosity, she retrieved the exact same political tome and quickly opened it to the marked page. Beneath her small penciled line, the aggressive black ink had made a triumphant return, still fresh and dark. Empathy, miss, is a weak currency, a dangerous luxury that those tasked with upholding the foundations of the world cannot afford to pay. Beatrice smiled, a broad, true smile that she had not shown in years. She took her pencil and, without a moment's hesitation, wrote, "If the foundation of the world upon which your grace leans is built entirely of ice, you are not permitted to bemoan the cold that plagues your castle." The invisible debate was officially underway. Day after day, the pages of the old treatise became the private, secret battlefield of 2 brilliant minds. They fenced, with fierce arguments, on philosophy, morality, the history of civilizations, and the hidden gears of society, through those pale margins. Beatrice, accustomed to the mental lethargy of her home, had never been so challenged or provoked, and she had never counterattacked with such sagacity and surgical precision. The silent anonymity offered by the graphite pencil and the black ink acted as a miraculous shield, allowing the monumental social abyss between the humiliated daughter of a nobleman in steep decline and one of the most formidable and wealthy dukes in England to vanish completely. She began to ache for the daily moment when she would open the philosophy tome, and she understood, from the rare pauses at Arthur's inkwell on the other side of the grand hall, that he awaited the silent girl's rebuttals with the same intellectual hunger that consumed him. The library was no longer merely the hiding place of a hunted young woman. It had irreversibly transformed into a meeting of equals. The invisible boundary that separated their worlds crumbled on a particularly freezing and rainy Tuesday afternoon. Water poured from the dark skies, beating relentlessly against the thick, leaded stained glass, muffling any sound from the outside. Beatrice found herself curled up in the folds of her velvety niche, her heart fluttering with excitement as she opened the treatise to check the highly anticipated reply concerning the origins of the morality of poverty. When she turned the yellowed leaf, however, the margin was immaculately white. A slight jolt ran down her spine as she registered, beneath the noise of the storm outside, the unmistakable sound of heavy leather boots stepping deliberately across the Persian rug. She jerked her head up. Arthur Pendelton was crossing the long expanse that separated them. He was not wearing his formal, aristocratic coat. He wore only a dark, woolen waistcoat molded over an immaculate white linen shirt, with the sleeves slightly rolled up, which stripped him of his social armor and lent him an overwhelming, carnal, and dangerously untamed presence. The Duke stopped mere inches from the seat embedded in the stone wall, tall and broad enough to cast his resolute shadow over her, completely eclipsing the little light coming from the tempest outside. "I find myself obliged to profoundly disagree with your latest and audacious premise, miss." Arthur's voice resonated downwards. His deep timbre, stripped of that usual sterile coldness with which he dealt with her father, now vibrated with a pure, incandescent challenge. To suggest in writing that human virtue and ethics are flexible constructs, molded by the whims of misery, is an unforgivable, argumentative shortcut. Beatrice's lungs locked. The Duke was confronting her right there, face to face, his voice echoing through the walls lined with centuries-old bookcases. The intricate jewel in which they danced had just leapt from the cold, graphite-stained pages into the warm, electric space between them. "It is not an argumentative shortcut, Your Grace. It is merely the raw, infallible portrait of the reality in which the greater part of the world dwells," she retorted without faltering. Her momentary terror had been instantly replaced by the intoxication of the debate, and she proudly raised her rounded chin to meet, unblinking, the abyssal darkness of the Duke's pupils. Dogmatic, unshakable moralism is an extremely easy thesis to cultivate in rooms warmed by immense hearths and bountiful tables. However, to those who walk beneath the weight of a rumbling stomach, unwavering ethics are invariably the second or third most important thought of the day. Arthur's eyes flashed. The unmistakable spark of pure intellectual surrender illuminated the darkness of his aristocratic face. He narrowed his eyes, leaning his powerful torso forward, and, with an overwhelming naturalness, rested his heavy hand on the rough granite beside Beatrice's head. The unexpected gesture sealed the space around them, locking the young woman in a dizzying, intimate bubble that made her chest rise and fall rapidly. "Am I to deduce, therefore, that your ladyship believes my highly acclaimed principles are solid only because I have never met the monster of true scarcity face to face?" he pressed, lowering his voice to a hoarse, predatory whisper. "I firmly believe that virtue, untested by fire, is nothing more than prolonged innocence." "Your Grace," Beatrice replied instantly, refusing to shrink back against the upholstered velvet, holding her imposing air. "And I dare wager that no ardent reader who frequents this illustrious library appears to be the sort of person inclined to blind innocence." The impact of her words reverberated. A second of terrifying silence settled. Then Arthur smiled, a splendid breaking of all his serious defenses, and let out a genuine laugh, a rich, seductive rumble that startled even the dense shadows in the corners of the hall. The icy, distant armor he wore like a disdainful lord finally melted entirely and dripped onto the carpeted floor. The man who then held the young woman's astounded gaze did not express the complacency of a nobleman exercising philanthropic charity. He radiated the ravenous exultation of a thirsty man who had suddenly found the oasis of his existence. The Duke observed her, finally. He saw every nuance of her scintillating brain. Smiling faintly from the corner of his delineated mouth, Arthur pushed away from the stone wall with fluid grace and turned his polished heels towards the immense aisle between the shelves. "Roberts!" Arthur's powerful voice thundered imperiously through the back of the house. The graying, impassive butler materialized by the enormous carved door frames in the blink of an eye. "The traditional 4 o'clock tea, from this day forward and without exception, shall be arranged upon my main desk, set strictly for 2. Prepare the Sèvres service and the French silver tray we inherited immediately. This afternoon we receive guests whose minds do not tolerate mediocrity. Meanwhile, a mere 3 rainy miles away, in the suffocating atmosphere of the Hastings Manor, the lightning reflected the human storms raging on the carpeted floor of the drawing room. The suddenly routine absence and the suspicious silence in the house triggered the worst within the family's deteriorating nerves. Clara rhythmically pounded the lampshade, pacing furiously from one corner to another with a trembling glass in her hand, whilst Eleanor tore at her bitten nails. I received the nauseating confirmation from the lips of the miller's maid, who sleeps with the junior groom of the Rochester estate, Clara hissed, spinning sharply to distill her gall and pointing her trembling index finger at the painted wall. That despicable rat doesn't restrict herself to fetching books in a mouldy corner and returning silently like the beggar she is. They occupy the same room together. They share that damned table and drink tea from the untouchable Rochester porcelain, as if she, the little scrap of the house, could carry herself as an equal. Eleanor gritted her sharp teeth, twisting her thin mouth into a hideous grimace of contained aversion. This will not go unnoticed by society, Clara. It is a direct affront to us. Rochester blatantly mocked the formal invitations to our select gatherings and evening soirees in town, preferring to isolate himself. What will everyone think if they discover that his great, unapproachable isolation is nothing but a futile pretext to daydream behind locked doors, discussing intellectual nonsense with our insignificant little monster? She walked towards the grate of the lit fireplace, the fire licking the firewood in brutal synchrony with the venomous hatred radiating from her body. The drab little mouse has bewitched them with her perpetual air of a wronged maiden and saint. She poses as misunderstood, but I swear to God I will not tolerate the absurd scene of watching the useless girl we crushed resting her feet upon our crowns. The pedestal she fancies she is secretly erecting will be dismantled stone by stone until she crawls. We shall drag her out of that aristocratic nest by whatever means necessary. And back in the immaculate cocoon of the library, the profane machinations of the family of darkness sounded distant, barred by thick oak and the continuous, comforting hum of the heavy rain streaming down the stained glass. The silver teapot rested empty upon the waxed mahogany wood. For the first unforgettable time, Beatrice sat with her back straight and her arms resting proudly on the curving arms of an upholstered armchair, openly discussing ancient dramatic literature aloud, looking straight into Rochester's eyes. The panic of being noticed had succumbed to the brutal thrill of the dialectical confrontation. They debated for over 2 solid hours with affectionate ferocity. The servile fear and the haughty detachment melted away, making room for an inescapable, magnetic vortex. In the final instant of the heated discussion, as Beatrice delivered the last smiling remark with modest triumph, Arthur calmly extended his large masculine hand, seeking gently to retrieve the silver teapots and plates on the lined table. In a disastrous and divine synchrony, Beatrice darted her delicate, pale hands forward to adjust her own ornate porcelain cup. The hardened knuckles of Arthur's fingers, thickened by years at the riding reins, lightly struck the silky, cold, and trembling skin of the back of the young visitor's hand. The slightest friction reverberated like an impetuous, palpable shock. The particles of dust and time paralyzed in the rarefied air. Both tragically caught their breath in locked throats, their eyelids freezing in a primal startle where there was no margin for purely philosophical interpretations, in a stupor and mute recognition of 2 naked souls. And suddenly, contrary to all British rationality, the Duke refused to withdraw his arm and pull back politely as the old noble manuals dictated. Quite the contrary, his breathing subtly heavy from an emotion never before braved in drawing rooms, he deliberately skirted the warm china and firmly wrapped all his enormous fingers around the woman's frozen hands resting there. The pressure was undeniable and hot, silencing all theories and printed letters, transmitting an immediate doom in which the seductive play of astute minds had summarily capitulated. The sanctuary of ideas yielded territory to the violent beats of erupting passion. The lines had been drawn. They were fated to tear down the structures of their worlds together. The atmosphere inside the library had changed irrevocably. The silence, once a solitary shield, was now dense, charged with a palpable electricity that bound Beatrice and Arthur. 3 days had passed since the brushing of hands over the warm porcelain, and the physical distance between them had shrunk to almost nothing. The vast mahogany table was no longer divided territory, but a shared space. On that golden afternoon, the light of the setting sun filtered through the western stained glass, casting beams of old gold over the Persian rug. Beatrice stood beside the Duke, their shoulders almost touching as they both leant over a fragile volume of French epic poetry. The scent of sandalwood and clean linen emanating from Arthur clouded her senses, making it impossible to focus on the printed verses. "You read tragedies with an obstinate hope, miss," Arthur murmured. His voice was a hoarse velvet, dangerously intimate, resonating only for her. He turned his face, his aristocratic profile mere inches from hers. There was no longer the usual cynicism in his dark eyes. There was a raw vulnerability, a silent plea for permission. "A tragedy only holds value if we believe that, under different circumstances, the protagonists could have triumphed, Your Grace," Beatrice replied in a whisper, unable to pull away. Her heart was beating in her throat. Arthur held her gaze. Slowly, he raised his hand, not to touch the page, but to slide his long fingers towards the inner pocket of his waistcoat. He had made a decision. Inside his coat rested a small pouch of supple leather that housed the torn page from the garden, meticulously cleaned, smoothed, and protected. He intended to give it to her. He intended to use that fragment of past pain to build an unbreakable promise of the future, to prove that he had seen her from the very first moment and that she would never need to hide from anyone ever again. "Beatrice," he said, her name leaving his lips for the first time without the formal title, laden with a reverence that made her tremble. "There is something I have kept since the first day, something that belongs to you and that—" The brutal crash of the heavy oak doors slamming violently against the stone door frames shattered the spell. Beatrice leapt back, trembling, the air leaving her lungs instantly. Arthur spun his body with the ferocity of an interrupted lion, his fists clenched in a reflex action. The expression of adoration melted like wax, giving way to an icy, murderous fury. On the threshold of the silent sanctuary, Clara and Eleanor stood, panting theatrically. Their silk dresses, replete with bows in scandalous shades of crimson and emerald green, assaulted the secular sobriety of the library in an obscene manner. The sickly, cheap floral perfume they wore seemed to invade the room like a toxic mist, polluting the clean air of beeswax and ancient paper. Behind them, the butler, Roberts, wore a mortified expression, a cut on his forehead where he had apparently been pushed against the doorknob whilst trying to physically bar the intruders. "Oh, Your Grace! 1,000 pardons for this indelicate invasion!" Clara exclaimed, her shrill voice echoing and profaning the vaulted ceiling. She brought her gloved hand to her chest, feigning a breathless despair that bordered on the comical. "We were seized by the most absolute panic. Their presence there was an incalculable violence." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face, the cold creeping up her legs until it paralyzed her spine. The outside world, cruel, petty, and merciless, had just broken down the doors of paradise. "How dare you cross the gates of this estate and invade my private chambers screaming?" Arthur's voice did not rise, but dropped to a tone so deep and threatening that the wooden floor itself seemed to vibrate. It was the voice of a man who possessed the power to destroy lineages with a mere wave of his hand. Eleanor shrank back instinctively, fear sparkling in her empty eyes. But Clara, blinded by sickly envy and sustained by the calculated venom of her narrative, took 2 audacious steps across the expensive rug. She ignored the deadly, evident hatred in the Duke's eyes and fixed her predatory gaze on her younger sister, who was visibly trembling, leaning against the cold edge of the table. "We have come to rescue you from embarrassment, Your Grace. We were terrified that our little Beatrice had overstepped all bounds of common sense and your patience," Clara fired off, her tone dripping with a false sisterly pity that sickened the stomach of anyone listening. "Our father is beside himself. The entire society speaks of nothing else. The rumor that Your Grace had to cancel his noble engagements in London merely to oversee our eccentric little sister and her ugly quirks has already taken over the whole town." "Leave! Immediately!" Arthur growled, every muscle in his body tense, taking a lethal step towards the invading women. But Clara was a strategist of cruelty. She knew exactly where to strike, and her target was not the steel-forged chest of the Duke. It was Beatrice's chronically fragile mind. "We perfectly understand your immense philanthropic heart, Your Grace," Clara continued hastily, firing the venomous words and keeping her eyes glued to Beatrice, ensuring that every syllable was a blade entering her sister's soul. "It is indescribably noble of you to take pity on her, a simple girl without feminine charms or drawing-room attractions, who hides in books because real life is too grand for her little head. Your charity, in allowing her to play the solitary academic here, was a magnanimous gesture of pity. But we cannot allow your immaculate reputation to become a joke in the corridors of the House of Lords merely because an unfortunate Hastings has become your new pet project." The word, pity, struck Beatrice like a point-blank shot. Pet project, charity, pity. The air in the room vanished completely. The crushing terror of the past, the deeply rooted belief in her bones that she was fundamentally unworthy, an aberration tolerated out of mere indulgent compassion, swallowed whole all the radiant light that had been born in those last few weeks. Beatrice's horrified gaze flew from Clara's smiling face to Arthur's rigid profile. The Duke was pale with blind fury, his lips compressed into a lethal line. He opened his mouth to physically annihilate Clara, to destroy that absurd lie at its root, but the seed of the venom had already sunk deep into the dark abyss of Beatrice's insecurities. In that second, she saw herself through her sister's disdainful eyes. The simple grey dress, dull and slightly worn at the hems. The bare hands stained with graphite from the long notes. The pathetic, ridiculous naivety of having dared to think that one of the most imposing, wealthy, and coveted men in the empire could look at her with a desire for equality, and not with the commiseration of an owner towards a wounded bird. Clara was right. Reality screamed it. Society was ridiculing him. Her dirty, inferior presence in the opulence of that library was dragging Rochester's name through the mud. She was an intolerable burden, a ready-made joke about to sink him. "Beatrice, do not listen to a single word from this delirious scum," Arthur ordered suddenly, abandoning his cold polish, turning to her with extreme urgency, holding out his massive hand, fingers spread open towards her. But Beatrice jerked back, stumbling over her own heavy skirt, fleeing his touch as if the extended hand were made of burning coals. Her physical recoil struck Arthur with the force of a punch to the stomach. The Duke stopped suddenly, his arm floating in the air, his dark eyes wide at the shocking rejection. He instinctively expected her to run and take shelter behind his broad back, not to shrink away from him in horror. They are right, Your Grace." Beatrice's voice came out painfully fractured, hoarse, with the thick tears she fought with all her might not to shed right there. "Beatrice, look me in the eyes immediately," Arthur demanded, desperation and confusion breaking the mask of absolute authority. "You know this is a fabricated atrocity." "No, the true atrocity was my boundless presumption." She swallowed hard, taking another step back towards the shadows of the neighboring bookcase. She felt the dizziness of a swoon approaching, but the fear of dragging him down with the social filth of her family granted her a brutal strength. She could not tarnish the only beautiful thing she had touched in her life. If he made a scene to protect her now, he would confirm the worst rumors to those snakes. She would definitively be his social ruin. "I have abused your invaluable hospitality and infinite charity far beyond what was socially acceptable. I beg you to forgive the unforgivable audacity of a foolish girl." Do not dare finish that sentence. Do not dare diminish yourself in my presence ever again, Arthur whispered harshly, his face contorted in indignant pain, taking a quick step towards her and completely ignoring the two intruders lurking happily at the entrance. "What we have built here was a benevolent pastime for your grace, for which my family shall be eternally grateful." Beatrice cut him off curtly, the lie shredding her own throat. She locked her gaze on the floor. If she raised her eyes and met his face, her self-destructive farce would crumble. She spun on her heels with a painfully mechanical rigidity. She walked towards the immense central aisle with long strides, her breath held, her eyes glazed with shock. Clara and Eleanor exchanged a furtive smile of absolute triumph, stepped aside with exaggerated elegance, and made way for their defeated youngest sister. Arthur tensed his wide legs, the tendons in his neck bulging. He made a move to advance across the rug, to grab her by her narrow waist, to order the guards to drag those two harpies by the hair out across the lawn, to burn the whole world down if necessary. But the single glance Beatrice threw over her small shoulder moments before crossing the stone threshold froze him in place. It was a look of absolute, cutting supplication. She wasn't merely fleeing in shame, she was begging, with a torn soul, for him to let her go, for him not to create a scandal that her sisters would happily use to bleed him dry in London. She was throwing herself into the abyss to save the sanctuary of Rochester from defamation. And the immense respect Arthur harbored for her mind, for the decision she was making, however stupidly poisoned it was the only chain in the universe strong enough to bind him to that floor. The double doors closed with a dull, long, and hollow thud, sealing the room and swallowing the female voices outside. Silence crashed back down upon Hastings' house many hours later. The dark, cramped room beneath the sloping roof now felt like a coffin. There was no box of books to offer illusions of escape, nor a loose page to keep in her pocket. Beatrice sat slowly on the freezing floorboards, hugged her knees to her aching chest, and buried her face in the grimy fabric of her skirt. Her crying did not even have the strength to manifest itself. There was only an absolute cold corroding her bones, the silent and complete death of any expectation of happiness. She had returned to her natural place, a ghost who did not deserve air, cloistered in her own pathetic life. Silent miles away, beneath the pitiless moonlight of the early evening, the legendary library of the Rochester estate no longer resembled an isolated sanctuary of ideas. It was a grand and majestic cemented tomb. Hours had passed, but Arthur Pendelton remained rooted to the exact same floorboard where she had left him, a living statue of repressed mourning. His gaze pierced the long, empty expanse of the Persian rug until it crossed the room and rested upon the east window niche. The brown velvet upholstery lay perfectly smooth and solitary. She was not there. Slowly, with the lethal precision of a beast that has just caught the scent of blood, he lowered his dark eyes to the surface of his desk. The volume of French epic poetry remained wide open. Beside the thick-covered book, Arthur thrust his firm hand into his own coat and pulled out the small protective envelope. He unfolded the soft leather. The torn page, old, worn, and stained by past tears, reflected the faint light of a single flickering candle. The undeniable, almost palpable proof of the incalculable worth that Beatrice refused to see in the mirror of her own mind. No tears formed in the Duke's eyes. Contemplative melancholy was a mediocre luxury reserved for men who accepted their losses without a fight. What germinated in the exact center of Arthur's broad chest, silent, deep, and destructive as an underground fire, was a cold, aristocratically precise, and absolutely directed wrath. They had trampled into his world with muddy feet and dared to steal the only thing that truly mattered to him. He clenched his large fists with a force that cracked his knuckles, his hard jaw locked like stone against the dense night air. The solitary and unshakable Duke of Ice would no longer shelter in the shadows of his books. He was ready to burn the entire London season to ashes if necessary. He was going to war. The monotonous ticking of the grandfather clock in the Hastings dining room used to dictate the rhythm of Beatrice's submission. 2 days had dragged by since her cowardly flight from the Rochester library. The domestic atmosphere had returned to its old, suffocating normality. At the table, beneath the dim light of the dusty chandelier, Clara and Eleanor sipped their thin broth with expressions of ill-concealed triumph. They had won. The little monster had been returned to her rightful place in the shadows. "You know, Eleanor," Clara began, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she tore a piece of bread, "I think the air of our home has done our little sister good. That excess of dust and difficult ideas was making her pale and giving her delusions of grandeur. It is a relief to know she has finally understood her place in the world." Beatrice kept her eyes on her plate, but the customary, silent weeping did not come. Her throat, which would once have closed in panic at their mockery, was strangely clear. The mind that had dueled with the Duke of Rochester, that had dissected the fall of empires and the morality of the nobility, could no longer shrink before such minuscule malice. Her sister's venom was not an absolute truth. It was merely pathetic futility. She raised her face. Her almond eyes met Clara's with an icy placidity. "I wonder, Clara," Beatrice pronounced, her voice firm, crystal clear, and entirely devoid of any tremor, "whether your sickly need to lock me in the shadows stems from a blind conviction that I am inferior, or from the absolute terror that should I be given a single beam of light, everyone will realize how incredibly empty you are inside." The silence that fell over the dining room was deafening. Eleanor's spoon slipped, striking the chipped porcelain with a sharp clink. Clara's face suddenly lost all its color, her mouth opening and closing without emitting a single sound in the face of such an unthinkable retort. Beatrice did not lower her head, nor did she retreat. The Duke's library might be lost forever, but the resolute woman who had been born within it refused to die. The crash of the front door being flung wide open cut through Clara's incipient indignation. Heavy, frantic footsteps echoed through to the dining room. Mr. Hastings burst into the room, his cravat completely undone, his thinning hair disheveled, and his face bathed in a cold sweat of pure despair. "Ruined!" he panted, leaning heavily on the edge of the table with both trembling hands. The vivid panic in his eyes was animalistic. "We have been completely decimated." Clara leapt up with a start, forgetting her sister's unforgivable affront. "Father, heavens above, what has happened?" "The Duke of Rochester!" Hastings roared, his voice breaking into a high, pathetic yelp. "His steward was at the town bank this afternoon. All our lease agreements for the mines have been summarily cancelled, without prior negotiation, without any warning whatsoever. Within hours, the creditors learned that Rochester had cut us off and began to demand immediate payment of our debts. But that is not the worst of it." He pulled a crumpled envelope from the pocket of his sweat-drenched coat and threw it onto the served plates. It bore the golden seal of the Danbury family. The Grand Garden Tea Party, the event that would close the season tomorrow. "Our invitations have been revoked. Formally, Lady Danbury sent a note stating that the Duke himself suggested, quite vehemently, that our presence would be regrettable for the harmony of the event. We have been banished from all local high society in a single, brutal blow." Horror twisted and disfigured Clara and Eleanor's features. Financial ruin was an immense disaster, but social annihilation to their egos was death in life. "How could he?" Eleanor stammered, bringing her hands to her styled hair. "Why such a monstrous retaliation out of nowhere?" Mr. Hastings snapped his head round, his bloodshot eyes locking onto his two eldest daughters. The memory of the lethal warning the Duke had given him in the garden, weeks ago, exploded in his dulled mind. "What have you done?" he hissed, advancing towards Clara and knocking over a chair, his paternal fury finally replacing his subservience. "He warned me in no uncertain terms. The Duke looked me in the eye and dictated that if a single hair on Beatrice's head was touched with disdain by any of you, he would ruin us. You went to his estate and caused a scene, didn't you? You stupid, envious vipers." Beatrice watched the complete implosion of her family sitting in absolute, processing silence. The initial shock gave way to an overwhelming, dizzying revelation that made her stomach drop. Arthur had not crossed his arms in heroic impassivity after her departure. He had not swallowed the scandal in silence merely to protect his own immaculate lineage. The silent and contained Duke of Ice had, the very instant the doors closed, declared a bloody and ruthless war against anyone who dared to hurt her. The shouting match in the dining room was suddenly interrupted by the hesitant figure of the old housekeeper, who cleared her throat insistently on the threshold. "Excuse me, sir. A rider from Rochester House is waiting at the back door. He brings a parcel, demanding to deliver it swiftly and exclusively into the hands of Miss Beatrice." The chaos cut through Mr. Hastings' violent accusations. All astounded eyes converged on Beatrice. Without asking permission, ignoring her father's protests and the shocked stares of her sisters, she stood up, smoothed her dark skirt, and walked towards the kitchens with her spine absolutely erect. The rider on the threshold, imposing in his restrained posture, handed her a parcel of brown paper firmly tied with thick string. There was no ceremonial seal adorning the package, revealing only the raw, undeniable haste of a direct order. Beatrice clutched the parcel to her chest, climbed the stairs entirely ignoring her father's pleading calls from below, and locked herself quickly in her tiny bedroom. With cold, trembling fingers, she undid the tight knot. The brown paper slipped and fell to the floor, revealing the heavy, familiar volume of French epic poetry. The exact same book they had pored over together, arm to arm, when her sisters had invaded and destroyed their sanctuary. Beatrice's heart raced against her ribs. She opened the sturdy leather cover. A slip of fine paper was folded and abruptly inserted into the exact page they had been reading. It was not a romantic or politely polished letter. It was a short message, handwritten in Arthur's thick black ink. The letters aggressive, scratched, and sharp, almost tearing the structure of the paper from the brute force with which the quill had been wielded. You preferred the cowardly humiliation of your own unworthy family to the protection of my absolute respect. You believed the lies spewed by minuscule minds rather than trust the immeasurable worth of your own. True cowardice, miss, is not yielding to an overwhelming enemy when one has no strength. It is doubting one's own undeniable honor and fleeing in terror from the one who recognizes it. I never offered you condescending pity. I offered you my equal. Beatrice let out a trembling, strangled breath, falling to her knees on the uneven wooden floor. Arthur's harsh words were not a sugar-coated consolation. They were a slap in the face, hard, brutally honest, and desperately passionate. The realization crashed down upon her with the weight of the world. He did not see her as a woefully broken maiden in need of compassion and charity. He was intimately, volcanically furious, precisely because he considered her brilliant, exceedingly worthy, and strong enough to fight by his side against British hypocrisy. And she had demeaned him, insulted him, by believing Clara's cheap lie that she was nothing but a pathetic project. The colossal pain of regret that pierced her was searing, corroding her old defenses. But, unlike all the other times she had suffered, this profound pain did not paralyze her or leave her weeping in corners. This pain purged her cowardice, burning away her illusions until nothing remained but ashes. Beatrice rose from the floor slowly, her muscles tense and resolute. The continuous fog of self-pity dissipated definitively. If she had ruined the only true and divine bond of her existence because of the venom of others, it fell to her to take full responsibility for repairing it. She would not return as a shamed victim, but bearing the same formidable bravery of the woman Arthur Pendelton saw and swore she was. She walked to the small, tarnished mirror. The reflected image did not boast exquisite lace or Parisian silks, and that mattered little now. There was a new, wild, and incandescent fire in her dark eyes, and a fearless haughtiness in the line of her jaw that did not depend on the empty approval of Clara or anyone else in society. She opened the creaking wardrobe and took out her dark blue woolen dress, the most decent and whole garment she possessed. It was perfectly clean, devoid of any aristocratic ornamental luxury, but it represented who she truly was. She brushed her brown hair with energetic strokes and pinned it high on her head in a firm and severe manner, without trying to use loose styles to hide her face. Beatrice picked up the book of French poetry and hugged it, feeling the pulse of Arthur's untamable words beating in perfect synchrony with her own racing blood. Tomorrow afternoon, Arthur would be in the monumental gardens of Lord Danbury, inescapably surrounded by the most ruthless, gossiping, and fierce elite in the British county. And Beatrice Hastings, the ignored woman of the bankrupt minor nobility, would walk straight into that den of gold-adorned lions, without an invitation, without family permission, without any shield whatsoever, willing to face the prejudice of the entire world with her chin held high, solely to stand before the man she loved and prove, in the public square, that she was not, and never would be, a coward. The perfectly manicured lawns of the Danbury estate gleamed under the brilliant afternoon sun, playing host to the cream of British society. Beneath tents of embroidered white silk, dozens of lords and ladies paraded their scandalously expensive attire, sipping crystal-clear champagne and exchanging venomous whispers. At the exact center of this epicenter of frivolity, Arthur Pendelton, the Duke of Rochester, stood like a statue of obsidian. Cold, untouchable, and lethal, he masterfully ignored the innumerable attempts at approach by the county's ambitious mothers. At the majestic wrought iron gates that isolated the estate from the outside world, the scene was pathetic. Mr. Hastings, his face red with profound humiliation, argued desperately with the uniformed guards, flanked by Clara and Eleanor. The two sisters craned their necks, trying in vain to be seen by someone influential within the gardens. Gossip about the sudden and absolute social and financial ruin of the Hastings was already spreading like wildfire amongst the tea tables. And then she appeared. Beatrice did not arrive in the safety of a hired carriage with the curtains drawn. She came on foot, walking along the dusty road, under the gazes of coachmen and passers-by. Her dark blue woolen dress, with its severe cut, absorbed the festive light, standing out as an immense point of sobriety in the sea of spring pastel shades. Her brown hair, pinned firmly at the top of her head, sported no exotic plumes or encrusted jewels. Against her proud chest, she clutched the thick, heavy volume of French epic poetry. "Beatrice, what are you doing, you insolent lunatic?" Clara hissed, advancing and grabbing her youngest sister's arm just before the great gates. "Do you wish to humiliate us even further in front of the guard? Go back to your hole." Beatrice did not shrink her shoulders. She did not look at the ground. She turned her face slowly and fixed Clara with a look of such placidity and innate superiority that the eldest sister instinctively let go of the coarse fabric, as if she had touched a hot coal. Without wasting a single word or breath on her astounded relatives, Beatrice advanced. The guards, stunned by the unquestionable haughtiness of that woman, did not dare cross their spears to bar her way. She stepped onto the perfect lawn. With each rhythmic step, the rustle of exuberant silks died away. The festive clinking of crystal glasses ceased abruptly. A deadly, scandalized silence spread through the vast crowd, like a shockwave. Hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto the intruder in rustic attire who was marching towards the center of the coveted event. Cruel whispers, the snap of opening fans, and muffled titters began to sprout from the offended aristocracy. The old Beatrice would have fainted with terror, feeling like the most inferior creature on earth. The woman forged in silent debates did not alter the rhythm of her own breathing. Her target was the man who now watched her, paralyzed, 20 paces away. Arthur had widened his dark eyes slightly as soon as he saw her break through the barriers of the crowd. The broad chest in his exquisite coat rose and fell visibly fast, his heavy, deadly hands unclasped from behind his back. High society parted like the Red Sea being cloven, not out of respect for her, but out of sheer terror of the Duke's reaction. Beatrice came to a halt, a mere 2 handspans away from Arthur. They faced each other. The silence that fell upon them was dense, heavy, and sparking. Beatrice held out her pale, bare hands, handing him the leather book, with the cruel and honest note hidden between its pages. Arthur took it with extreme slowness, his dark eyes sweeping over the woman's defiant and courageous face. "Your Grace was absolutely correct in what you wrote," Beatrice began. Her voice did not tremble. It was not restrained, but rather projected crystal clear upon the breeze of the silent garden for the social vultures to hear. "True cowardice is doubting one's own honor. I doubted mine faultily, and, in doing so, committed the worst of all sins. I doubted your unshakable judgment. I fled. I fled because I allowed myself to be contaminated by the shallow whispering of minds oppressed by their own smallness. Vulgar minds that cannot conceive the simple idea that the intellect is infinitely more powerful than an empty title or a bank account." A collective gasp echoed like a stumble amongst the guests of the high circle. "I come here, under the unforgiving sun and before this court of observers, to formally ask your forgiveness for my intellectual offense, Arthur," Beatrice continued, calling him by his given name to the scandal of the ladies around them, her chin pointed towards eternity. "My mind belongs to the sanctuary that your grace opened for me, and I refuse to shrink back before this false world ever again. I refuse to tarnish the brilliance of what we built in the margins of our books to please the comfort and ignorance of others. The unbelievable audacity of the wool-clad girl's words shattered any remnant of noble breeding. The contained murmur of repudiation exploded into a noisy indignation. "This is an outrage! An absolute sacrilege in my home!" vociferated Lady Danbury, the hostess of the grand tea, marching with firm, heavy steps towards the center of the event, her jewels trembling beneath a neck congested with rage. "How dare this ruined, mediocre little creature invade my private gardens and harass the Honorable Duke of Rochester with such shameful romantic delusions? Guards, remove this impostor from here immediately." Soldiers of the estate began to advance cautiously, but Arthur did not even need to look in their direction. "Take but one more step, Danbury, and I shall pulverize the name of this family and tear the foundations of this house from British soil before dawn." Arthur's voice cut off the oxygen on the lawn. It was not a shout. It was the sound of the razor-sharp edge of the executioner's axe sliding. The hostess stopped dead, as pale as chalk. Shock paralyzed the entire elite breathing in the flowered gardens. Arthur looked no more at the most influential woman in the county. He turned slowly in profile, studying the astounded mob with the magnanimous disdain of a lion contemplating caged rats. With the precision of one who dictates the future, he thrust his right hand into the black velvet pocket sewn into the lining of his coat and withdrew the fine leather pouch. Unfolding the wrapper without haste, Arthur revealed the treasure of his life. A piece of rough paper, with its edges violently torn on the diagonal, the old printed words blurred by the water of past tears. He raised the page in the same way a king brandishes a victorious standard. "You orbit my shadow daily, flaunting your dusty family trees and adorning your own nothingness with silks from France, begging for a crumb of my financial presence." Arthur speechified, annihilating the arrogance of dozens of lords in a ruthless verbal blow. "You think yourselves the possessors of true greatness, simply because you have never had to fight to protect the fragile riches you keep beneath your empty roofs." The Duke held the paper fiercely to his chest and locked his flaming, devoted gaze onto Beatrice's face. This woman, whose refuges were cowardly destroyed by the envy of blood, kept with her nothing more than this simple page stained with pain, and yet found within herself the overwhelming bravery to challenge me. She dared to cure the fetid wound of my own isolation, bearing the most formidable, dangerous, and resilient mind the Empire harbors under this sun. She did not invade your event. Arthur's voice vibrated with a harsh roar of pride. She subjected her own greatness to this pitiful gathering, to grace us with her invaluable presence. Ignoring the irremediable scandal, centuries of aristocratic traditions, or the frozen perplexity of the Countess hosting the event, Arthur Pendelton bowed, planting one knee firmly upon the immaculate grass. He abandoned secular formality as he took Beatrice's pale hands, placing upon them a reverence with closed lips. "I no longer offer you the Rochester Library as a solitary shelter to hide from the rain, Beatrice," Arthur whispered passionately, his words soaring just high enough to be caught by the bewildered guests around them. "I offer it at your feet as your own domain. I want your brilliant impertinence on all my manuscripts. I want your insolence in the margins of my entire life. I demand the colossal honor of remaining as your intellectual equal and companion until my last breath. Be my wife and the Duchess of Rochester, and the two of us shall govern and rewrite the rest of the world." Beyond the main tent, locked out for good behind the adorned iron gates, Clara and Eleanor witnessed the devastating scene that fate had thrown before their eyes. The proud and terrifying Duke of Ice, kneeling in the dirt of his own free will, devoted body and soul before the sister they had once treated as unbearable scum. The crushing realization cut the air from their lungs. The submissive sister would become the most powerful, wealthy, and invulnerable leader in the nation, whilst the ruin of the Hastings family would remain sealed for the rest of their pathetic lives. Beatrice gazed into the black ocean that was Arthur's gaze. The hundreds of judging aristocrats vanished. The petty gossip ceased to echo. The family who had not known how to love her already belonged to the distant past. The final answer, far from a mere trembling nod of a maiden falling into the arms of a benefactor, exhaled from her lungs like a royal demand in a tone of absolute acceptance. "Yes," she answered, firm and unshakable, letting a triumphant, brilliant, and seductive smile of pure consecration bloom. "Provided your grace can find the courage to systematically lose all our debates in the mornings." Arthur exploded into the deepest, most resonant, sincere, and liberating laugh that had ever echoed across the open meadows of Danbury. Rising agilely from the English soil, he linked her arm with infinite possessiveness and tenderness. Without offering a single drop of farewell, justification, or ceremonial bow to the petrified nobility behind them, the Duke and Duchess of Rochester turned and marched with grandeur in the opposite direction, crushing the shards of aristocratic conventions beneath the setting sun. 3 months later, the pale, golden morning light poured generously, piercing the immense, leaded glass panes that enclosed the eastern wall of the ancient library of Rochester House. The silence of paradise was adorned only by the sharp scratch of a quill dipping into black ink and the soft, warm crackle of the great marble fireplaces at the sides. The thick aroma of protective wax, valuable leathers aged by knowledge, and bound pages hovered absolute, rising from the polished floor to the stained glass, high on the dizzying ceiling. In the core of that invulnerable mental oasis, the famous east window niche found itself entirely stripped of fearful shadows. Settled placidly against the soft velvet rest, the generous fall of her emerald winter silk dress spreading fluidly to fill the entire width of the stone, Beatrice read the core of an intricate European political manuscript. The small graphite of the pencil filled the corner of the book with yet another refined counter-argument. Resting the filled page momentarily on her lap, she raised her perceptive eyes to cross the immense distance opened by the silk rug. Arthur paused the analysis of his papers atop the formidable main mahogany desk. With ink still faintly staining his fingers, the Duke adjusted his commanding posture in the chair and lifted his steaming cup of the finest French porcelain with unparalleled subtlety towards the illuminated window. A tacit, perpetual, and grateful toast to the owner of the scintillating mind who had finally given him peace and shelter. The books in that vast hall no longer represented magical doors through which Beatrice escaped the sufferings of real life. The sanctuary had ceased to be a silent escape route. It had now become, officially, sovereignly, and truly, the invincible empire of her eternal home. We turn the final page of yet another story. If this romance has captured a place in your heart, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It has been an absolute pleasure sharing this moment with you. Until we meet again,